Hi everyone, I am Benjamin Kohler. I am a PhD student at the ETH Center for Law and Economics here at ETH Zurich. Today with me is Associate Professor Kevin Cope. We are going to talk about judicial ideology. Thank you so much for being here with me, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.
So, human behavior is deeply driven by normative personal beliefs. That is, convictions about what is right and wrong and how the world should look like. And as social science researchers, we are deeply interested in understanding these beliefs to understand human decision making. This especially applies to the courtroom, where judges can have enormous consequential decisions. I'm very happy that you are with me here today as an expert on this field and to talk with you about the Jurist-Derived Judicial Ideology Score project. As a beginning, maybe could you give us a little summary of this project?
Sure. So social scientists and especially political scientists have been interested in trying to understand why judges decide cases as they do for decades, going back at least to the 1930s and 1940s, when they started using quantitative measures, so counting the number of affirmances or reversals, of votes for a defendant or a plaintiff and so forth. But just in the last few decades, with the increases in computing power, there has been an explosion of new methods using such things as Bayesian methods and other more sophisticated methods of trying to measure judicial ideology. But the challenge in all of these is that unlike legislatures who sit and hear the same bills or the same proposed laws as one body, judges hear all different sorts of cases. So it becomes difficult to compare their behavior with each other, since we'd essentially be comparing apples and oranges. So what the JuDJIS project does is, rather than counting votes and trying to compare the votes to each other, or using a proxy measure of politicians or clerks or something like that, it relies on the expert evaluations of tens of thousands of lawyers, or what we call jurists, who have appeared before the judges, are familiar with their style of judging, with their ideology, and they write written evaluations, which I then convert into quantitative scores and can publish a systematic, one-dimensional or more than one-dimensional measure of all of the judges' ideologies.
Thank you very much for the summary. Before talking about your empirical contribution, maybe you could give us a brief definition of what is judicial ideology and what problems can arise when defining that term.
Well, judicial ideology is one of those terms that virtually nobody can agree on, and we just kind of throw out there and assume we know what it means, but in reality, people assume that it means all sorts of different things. So you have to choose one definition, I think, before you measure something. So what I've chosen to define ideology as the normative set of beliefs about the appropriate role of law and courts in a judicial system, and how that is applied to resolve a given legal issue.
Interesting. Now, looking at the data that you use to measure judicial ideology, could you give us a little bit more on what the dataset looks like and how does it differ from previous measures of judicial ideology?
Sure. So let me just go back and explain in a nutshell what some of the other measures are. So in the United States, we have different levels of the court system. Most people are familiar with the Supreme Court, which is 9 judges or justices. And in general, they all hear the same cases. So relatively speaking, it's easy to compare their performance with each other because like a parliament or a legislature, they're all hearing the same cases. It becomes a lot more difficult when we're dealing with hundreds of appellate judges or trial-level district court judges who are hearing all different sorts of cases. So one method that's been introduced over 20 years ago about 20 years ago to get at appellate judges was to look at the members of Congress who are involved in their selection. And just for those who may be less familiar, in the United States, senators have some influence into who is nominated for these appellate judgeships. And using the voting records, using a system called Nominate, invented by Poole and Rosenthal, the researchers who developed the scores called Judicial Common Space Scores would attribute the voting record of those senators involved in the judges' selection to the judges themselves, with the assumption being that the senators would like to have judges who more or less shared their view of how policy should be made. And so this helps to get around the problem that the judges are hearing different types of cases because you have members of the Senate who are all voting on the same types of bills involved in the selection. And this is really an innovative method developed by Lee Epstein and her colleagues. It, of course, has some shortcomings in that before the judge even hears a case, they have their score assigned to them. So anything they may do as a judge is not factored into the score. It's locked in before they even take the bench. And it also is, you could call it more a measure of the judge's politics or assumed politics than their actual judging behavior. And there are some other methods as well that also use political proxy methods. But what I was trying to do was develop a measure that's based on actually on judging itself, thus the name JuDJIS. And also there's what we call dynamic. It can change over time as a judge's ideology may change. So I was lucky to be familiar with this project that's been going on since the late 80s, published by Wolters Kluwer, an academic publisher, where they survey thousands of lawyers around the country who are familiar with all of the hundreds of judges, both at the appellate level and the district level, and they get their free-form, open-ended responses to questions about their ideology and their temperament and their ability and so forth, a long series of questions, and they publish their answers in prose. And so I had the idea, what if we could use text analysis techniques to transform that language, the qualitative evaluations, into quantitative evaluations, and thus rely on the expertise of these experts, which would allow us to put all of the judges on a single scale, even though they're sitting on different courts and hearing different types of cases.
Interesting. You also develop a new text-based method to measure judicial ideology, the hierarchical engram. Maybe you could give us a brief introduction in how this method works and what the key advantages are compared to, for instance, an LLM-based measure.
Well, to be honest, when I started this project, there was no such thing as an LLM or large language model, which we now know, the most famous ChatGPT. To the extent that they did exist, they were not available or widely used. So I started this in around 2015. And even now, I suspect that using large language models would have certainly some advantages, but also some drawbacks. So let me step back and tell you the method that I do use. So some people may have heard of unigrams, which is basically a fancy name for a word. And people have used this to try to quantify text for some time. The way it works is you create a dictionary or use an existing dictionary of unigrams, and each unigram or word has a value assigned to it. So that could exist on a scale of happy to sad, with the happiest words getting the highest scores and the saddest ones getting the lowest scores. It could be really a scale of anything that you could come up with. And I wanted to do so for judicial ideology. Now, there wasn't an existing dictionary, so I had to invent one. But I also recognized that single words may not really capture the context and the nuance and the depth of evaluations in these judicial evaluations. So I'm using something called n-grams, which just means n for any number of words. In this case, it's anywhere from 1 to 9 words. So it's a phrase from 1 word, so just a single word, up to 9 words, a phrase of 9 words. So an example might be, they're very liberal but give you a fair shake, or something like might be a common evaluation. And so I first look at the entire corpus and identify the most commonly used n-grams, and then create a dictionary where each of these thousands and thousands of n-grams, ranging from 1 to 9 words, is assigned a value on a left to right scale, from liberal to conservative. And then the algorithm looks to the text and finds these n-grams in the evaluation and simply assigns them to that judge and takes the average of all of the n-grams. So it's actually, in operation, quite simple. Now, it becomes a little bit more complex when we have n-grams within n-grams, what we call nesting. So you might say, there might be an evaluation that says, not very conservative, right? So would you code the conservative part, the very conservative part, or the not very conservative part? Those all obviously have very different connotations. And so what the hierarchical method does is it takes the longest, or what we call the senior one, and gives the n-gram the value of that one. So not very conservative would be, maybe slightly conservative, but not terribly so. And it turns out that's kind of a difficult data problem to work out and to program. So I had some great help with that from folks at our university, our legal data lab. But once you're able to get it done, I'm confident that it does a pretty good job of capturing the nuance and the expressed intent of these evaluations.
Very interesting. Looking at your results, are judges more conservative or liberal on average? And what is the driver behind that bias, if you want to call it like that?
Right. Well, first of all, in the U.S. judiciary, as it stands now, we simply have more judges who are appointed by Republican presidents. So if we take the average of all the judges, we're going to see a slight conservative slant. But we also find, and I've just begun to analyze the data, so check back later for more. I'm sure this will turn into a paper, that Republican presidents are appointing judges who turn out to be more conservative than the Democratic presidents appoint judges who turn out to be liberal. In other words, on a scale of -1 being the most liberal to 1 being the most conservative, the average Republican appointed judge might be something like a 0.4, so moderately conservative, but then the average Democratic point judge might be something like a -0.2 or -0.3. So not as liberal as the conservative judges are conservative. The reason for this is a good question and something I'm still exploring.
Thank you very much for presenting your research. Maybe as a last question, we look a little bit at the implications of your work. Now, in your results, you also show that your measure is more predictive of actual judge behavior than previous measures. What does that mean for ideology measures outside the courtroom? Should we now start crowdsourcing expert-led comments on politicians and CEOs as well?
Mm-hmm. So when I came up with this measure, I thought that theoretically it had some nice traits that the other measures couldn't duplicate. I already explained some of those, the fact that it's based on actual judging and can change over time and so forth. and might have different dimensions. But ultimately, if it can't predict what judges are going to do, then what good is it? So, early on in the project, as a pilot, I started looking at how can it predict cases decided later on so I had a database of case outcomes, thousands of decisions from appellate courts, and I looked at to what extent do we expect a more liberal panel, so appellate judges sit in panels of 3, do we expect a more liberal panel, say where the median judge has a score of, say, negative 0.2, is that going to be more likely to produce a liberal outcome than a panel that has a score of, say, 0.2, which is on the conservative side? And then I stacked it up against the other existing measures, such as the ones based on the Senate's voting record, the judicial common space, another method based on clerkship hiring, the clerkship-based scores, and then kind of the oldest method, which is just the party of the appointing president. Are they a Republican or Democrat? And it turns out that the judge's method is pretty significantly does a better job of predicting outcomes, especially when it comes to what we call en banc cases, which is where all of the judges in a given court hear a case after it's been appealed. So sort of an intermediate step between a panel and the Supreme Court. These tend to be the most controversial cases, the most ideologically salient cases. And so it does a fairly good job of predicting the outcomes in those sorts of cases, especially relative to existing methods. So obviously I'm pleased about that. It makes me think that it'd be great if researchers would start to at least incorporate these scores into future research and maybe could cause people to re-evaluate existing studies and see if the findings are consistent with previous ones based on different scores. As to applications outside, I really like the idea of expert-based measures. Unfortunately, they do have some limitations in that you do need to have this corpus of evaluations. Now, I never could have done those myself. First of all, they were started in 1987 when I was barely sentient, and it would cost many tens of millions of dollars to do all this research. So it's helpful to have someone who's already doing that you can draw on, to have an existing qualitative data set. So you would need that if you're using it for a body, whether it's a legislature or any other group that's of any size. Saying that, some have begun to use it on a smaller scale for foreign courts, for international courts that are just a few judges rather than thousands. So it does have some applications there. Though I do still think that if you have a body such as a legislature that's hearing all the same sorts of questions, whether it's bills or cases, probably the best method is just to use some sort of quantitative scaling technique where you compare the votes with each other. And since we don't have that in the majority of the court system, that's what led me to create the JuDJIS system. So I think that it's going to be desirable and have a lot of attractive qualities for people who are interested in the lower courts, the appellate courts, and the district courts. But we do have existing measures for, say, Supreme Courts, the Martin and Quinn scores that still do a really good job of estimating ideology.
Thank you again for being with us today, Kevin. We are looking forward to your future contributions.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And to our viewers, thank you very much for joining today, and I'm looking forward to the next one.